The dust storm rolled across Dodge City on a late May evening in 1876, whipping grit into the eyes of townsfolk who gathered with hungry curiosity at the wooden auction block, their voices a mixture of whispers and cruel laughter. For tonight was not about cattle or horses, but about a woman, a heavy woman named Mercy, whose trembling hands clutched at the faded shawl around her shoulders, as though it were the last shield left between her and a world that refused to see her worth. And though she held her chin high, the jeers cut deep, each word another lash against her pride. Yet the crowd pressed closer, coins clinking in greedy palms, boots scuffing in the dirt, their eyes sharp and merciless, until from the haze of swirling dust a figure appeared, tall in the saddle, his hat brim shadowing a weathered face, his steps slow, deliberate, carrying the weight of silence heavier than any man's mockery. And as the auctioneer barked for bids, the stranger's voice cut through like the crack of a rifle, calm but unyielding. "I didn't buy you, Mercy. I saved you." Words that froze the mob, turning laughter into stunned quiet, for in that single moment the course of her fate shifted forever. Dodge City, Kansas Territory, May 1876, was a place where dust storms swept through wooden streets and the law struggled to stand firm against hunger, greed, and violence. A town where every glance carried suspicion and every night echoed with boots, whiskey, and gunfire. And for women without family there was little protection, for they were treated as property to be traded or cast aside. Yet within this harsh frontier stood Mercy, mocked for her weight but never broken, carrying herself with quiet dignity and a hidden strength that no cruel laughter could strip away from her soul. The crowd pressed closer as the auctioneer's voice rose above the restless murmur. His hammer lifted, his eyes scanning for the highest bid, and Mercy stood frozen, her breath shallow, her heart pounding as the laughter stung sharper than any whip. When suddenly the heavy creak of leather boots striking the ground silenced the square, and every head turned toward a tall drifter stepping from the settling haze of dust, his wide hat low, his jaw shadowed with days of travel, his eyes steady and unreadable, and whispers rippled through the crowd, for they knew his name, Eli Carter, a man who carried the weight of unspoken stories, a rugged wanderer, whose past was marked by scars both seen and hidden, a man feared not for his weapon but for the silence that wrapped around him like iron. And in that moment the hammer froze mid-air as Eli's voice broke the jeers, deep and calm yet unyielding, telling the auctioneer and every soul present that this sale would not happen, his words striking with more force than a bullet, and gasps followed as he walked to Mercy, his steps slow but deliberate, the dust curling around his boots, his hand resting lightly on the worn leather of his belt, not in threat but in conviction. And when he reached her side, his gaze met hers, steady and without judgment, then turned to the crowd, and he declared with a quiet fire that burned against their cruelty, "I didn't buy you, Mercy. I saved you." A sentence that shattered the smirks and forced even the boldest to avert their eyes. For no man had ever spoken such words in that place. No man had dared to strip the town of its mocking power. And Mercy felt her chest rise with a new breath, as the chains of shame seemed to loosen, though no iron held her, the silence that followed deeper than the storm outside, until the auctioneer, red-faced and stammering, lowered his hammer with trembling hands, muttering excuses that no one cared to hear, because every eye was fixed on Eli Carter, the stranger who had turned a woman's humiliation into defiance, who had made the crowd witness their own cruelty reflected back at them, and Mercy's knees threatened to buckle beneath the weight of what had just happened. Yet Eli's presence steadied her, a reminder that not all men measured worth in pounds or coins, that in the vast emptiness of the frontier there could still exist a hand that chose to lift rather than destroy. And as the crowd broke apart, whispers chasing each other down the narrow streets, some in disbelief, others in anger, and a few in quiet admiration, Mercy and Eli stood side by side. Two strangers bound not by trade or force but by a single act that rewrote her fate beneath the fading Kansas sun, leaving the town unsettled, the air thick with questions of who this drifter was and why he had chosen her. And though Mercy herself did not yet know the answer, she understood one truth with every beat of her heart, that her story was no longer written by those who laughed, but by the man who refused to let her be sold. Whispers traveled faster than the prairie wind, slipping through saloon doors and over the clatter of poker chips. From the church steps to the alleys where dust never settled, voices asking why a lone cowboy would step between a jeering crowd and a woman they had already judged. Why Eli Carter, a drifter who spoke little and stayed less, would place himself in the center of scandal. And the questions grew darker as men leaned close and muttered about secrets, debts and shadows that always follow men who refuse to speak of their past, while Mercy walked with her head low, unsure if the stranger's words were truly meant to protect or if they carried a hidden price that would someday be demanded of her. And though Eli offered no claim upon her, only a quiet nod when she caught his eye, her heart carried the weight of doubt, for in a land where nothing was free, Kindness itself felt like a chain waiting to tighten, and the unease deepened when a black horse thundered into town, followed by 3 more, riders with faces burned hard by the sun, and eyes sharp with memory, outlaws whose names were not spoken loudly, but known by the scars they left behind. And among them was a man who carried a mark Mercy did not understand, but Eli did. For once their boots hit the ground. The silence in his gaze turned heavier, his hand resting on the belt at his hip not in anger but in warning, and the town watched from doorways as these riders fixed their attention on Eli, their words dripping with mockery as they called him by a name Mercy had never heard, a name tied to a life he thought he had buried. And though she wanted to step back, something in her stirred as she realized the danger was not hers alone, that Eli had enemies who carried old grudges like loaded rifles, and the men circled him with voices low but sharp, accusing him of betrayal, of walking away when their bond had been written in stolen gold and blood. And Mercy felt her chest tighten because now she understood why whispers claimed he lived more in silence than in fire. For the past he had carried was darker than she imagined, and when one of the outlaws cast his eyes toward her, grinning with a cruelty she had known too well, Eli stepped forward, his jaw set, his voice even yet cold, telling them she was under his protection, words that made Mercy's pulse race because they bound her to him in ways she had not asked for yet, in ways she could not walk away from. And as the gang's laughter echoed into the Kansas dusk, the crowd scattered, doors slammed, shutters closed, leaving only Mercy, Eli, and the threat of men who promised they would return when the sun dipped lower, carrying with them not just vengeance, but a storm that would test whether Eli's silence could hold, and whether Mercy's hidden strength was enough to survive what was coming. The night settled heavy over the plains, the threat of the outlaw gang lingering like thunder in the distance. Yet around Eli's small campfire, a different story began to take shape as Mercy quietly moved with steady hands, gathering kindling, stirring beans in a battered pot, and laying out a simple meal as though the act itself could hold back the darkness pressing in. And when Eli returned from scouting the ridge, his shirt torn and a shallow cut marking his arm, she did not flinch or shrink away but knelt beside him with cloth and water, her fingers trembling only for a moment before finding a calm strength, cleaning the wound with care, binding it with strips from her own shawl, her eyes lifting to his only when she felt his gaze upon her. And in that silence, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that went deeper than words. For Eli, who had carried weight enough for any man, saw not pity in her eyes but resolve. And Mercy, who had been told her whole life that she was a burden, found herself needed in ways no cruel voice could deny. And when morning came and townsfolk passed their camp with mocking remarks, whispering about a woman too broad to keep up with a drifter, Mercy stood tall, her back straight, her voice firm as she answered them without shame, her courage silencing their laughter more effectively than any gun could. And Eli, watching her face the world that had once crushed her, felt the truth settle in his chest that her worth was not measured in the shallow standards of a harsh town, but in the compassion that kept a man standing, the loyalty that did not bend under scorn, and the strength that could turn fear into defiance. And slowly, as the days stretched into nights, Mercy began to let the walls around her heart fall piece by piece, learning that Eli asked for nothing in return for his defense, that his silence was not a trap, but a shield. And she started to trust that perhaps kindness did not always come with chains, that maybe she was not a weight to be carried but a survivor meant to walk beside someone. And Eli, hardened by years of betrayal, found himself softening in her presence, seeing in her the rare truth that survival was not only about the quickest draw or the sharpest eye, but about endurance, compassion, and a spirit that refused to break. And as the fire crackled beneath the endless Kansas sky, both knew without speaking that whatever storm the outlaw gang would bring, they had already found in each other the strength that frontier life demanded, not forged by bargains or fear, but by the quiet power of trust slowly rebuilt in the shadows of a world that had once denied them both. The sun dipped low across the Kansas horizon, painting the prairie in blood-red light as Eli led Mercy along the narrow trail skirting the edge of town, his instincts sharp enough to feel the trap before the riders appeared. And then from the ridge came the pounding of hooves, the outlaw gang spilling into view with dust rising behind them, their faces set with the hard sneer of men who had waited too long to settle an old score. And when they drew their guns, the air grew so heavy Mercy could taste the metal of fear on her tongue. Yet instead of retreating behind the rocks as Eli ordered, she stepped forward with sudden fire in her eyes, her voice steady as she called out to the men, drawing their focus toward her and away from him, her hands raised but her courage unshaken. A distraction bold enough to carve out seconds that meant survival, and in that heartbeat Eli moved, his revolver flashing from its holster with the speed of a rattler's strike, the crack of gunfire tearing through the dusk as dust exploded around them, bullets splitting wood and stone. the air filled with smoke and the thunder of hooves, and still Mercy held her ground, refusing to cower even when one of the gangmen swung his aim her way, her defiance giving Eli the chance to drop him with a single shot that echoed like judgment across the ridge. And the fight raged on, dirt rising in choking clouds as shadows clashed against the last light of day, until the final outlaw fell silent in the dust, leaving only the hollow wind and the echo of spent shells scattered across the trail. And Eli stood breathing hard, his arm grazed but his spirit unbroken, his eyes finding Mercy where she stood, her chest heaving, her dress torn, her hands trembling yet her gaze fierce as steel. And in that moment, no words were needed because both understood the truth written in the smoke that curled into the night, that their bond was not born of pity or chance, but of fire and risk, of wounds tended and courage shared. And as silence returned to the prairie, broken only by the cry of a far coyote, Eli holstered his gun while Mercy stepped closer, her hand brushing his sleeve, not in weakness but in steady certainty. And together they walked past the fallen men, leaving the past buried beneath the dust, the night carrying them forward into a future neither had expected yet both had chosen, their survival a testament not to chance, but to the strength they had discovered in each other beneath the unforgiving Kansas sky. The first light of dawn stretched across the plains as Dodge City stirred from its uneasy sleep, doors creaking open, eyes peering out to witness the sight of Eli Carter and Mercy riding side by side, their silhouettes framed against the rising sun, a scene so unexpected that the same townsfolk who once mocked her now stood silent, their laughter swallowed by the weight of what they had seen her endure. And as the horse's hooves struck the earth in steady rhythm, it was not pity that followed her, but a quiet respect that no one dared speak aloud. For she had faced shame and danger yet walked away unbroken. Her courage burned into the dust of the street, and Eli, once a shadowed drifter, had found in her a reason to stay, a reason to fight. And together they became more than survivors. They became a reminder that worth is not carved by cruel eyes but by the strength of the heart. And as the horizon swallowed their figures, the final truth lingered like an echo. In a land where people were judged by what they looked like, one cowboy saw what no one else did, a woman's true worth, and for Mercy, that was the freedom she had always prayed for. Now tell me, if you had lived in Dodge City that day, would you have seen what Eli saw or would you have joined the crowd? Share your thoughts below, and if stories like this stir your heart, then keep riding with us. Watch more tales at Wild West Echoes, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so the echoes of the frontier never fade.